Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist. I'm here with Jen Bentley, the Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, as we discuss today's topic. Welcome back to the podcast, Jen.
Thanks, Fred. We got a new year. We're coming into 2023, so kind of looking forward to what the season brings to us.
Absolutely. And we've done this in January a couple of years, and it's needed. It's when people are kind of looking forward. So we're excited to have Dr. Dennis Toddy. He's the director of the USDA Climate Hub in Ames. He's a native of Iowa with his BS and PhD from ISU in meteorology and agricultural meteorology. He spent 2 stints in South Dakota, first completing his master's at South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, and most recently as an associate professor and state climatologist for South Dakota at South Dakota State University. He's known all over our region and across the country, and in fact is the former president of the American Association of State Climatologists. Dr. Toddy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Hopefully I'm known for good things and not for bringing bad things. They told me that when I moved to South Dakota. They didn't have problems up there until I came there.
Imagine that. Let's start by explaining what is the Climate Hub?
Sure. We are a part of USDA, and we sit in a USDA is an agency of a bunch of different agencies, and one of those is called the Agricultural Research Service. And the ARS runs a laboratory called the National Laboratory for Agriculture and the Environment that sits on campus at Iowa State. For those of you people who have been around for a while, you might know it as the Soil Tilth Lab. But our goal with the Climate Hub is we are one of 10 climate hubs nationally, and our job is to create and help deliver information about climate agriculture interactions, the wide range of agricultural interactions on near-term issues like drought and major events, and looking at longer-term climate changes that will be affecting agriculture to try to help agriculture deal with them. Anyone involved with agriculture knows that there are weather and climate issues. And so our job is to help them understand them better and hopefully make better decisions to be able to deal with them.
Let's go back to the basics with this next question. Explain to me what's the difference between climate and weather.
Okay, always this ongoing issue of what is weather and whether is climate, and there's some of climatologists have some unique little ways of describing it, like climate is your wardrobe and weather is what you wear that day, or climate is your batting average and weather is if you get a hit or not that time when you're up at bat. When you're talking about these kinds of issues, weather is near term, on the order of days, maybe days to weeks, that of the changes and the variable changes that we see throughout our year. And then climate is the sum total of those, or the overall assessment of describing what our whole entity is like, our seasonality, and the shifts from winter to spring to summer and those sorts of things. But then, within climate, there's a lot of variability. We know that we have wetter periods and drier periods, not regular, but, we know that we have things like the Dust Bowl years, and then we have wet periods in the 90s, like 1993 and things like that. So there's a lot of variability involved in this. But the other part of this is looking at these larger climate changes, which are made up of lots of little changes in weather, but lots of these larger climate changes that we try to describe and help people understand how they're impacting agriculture. And there really are a ton of these. We could spend a whole hour or two talking about some of these different ones and some of the issues related to that. But there are, we try to help people understand the impacts, and then try to help share that information so people can deal with them. So whether it's those day-to-day changes, that's always going to be there. But, some of those day-to-day changes all add up to bigger changes that we see in the.
Yeah, and Fred, I think, from both sides of the state, we had pretty good yields this year, right? Maybe Northwest was a little bit drier and Northeast had a little bit more moisture than Northwest, but overall, I think our trends for yields were up. And do you forecast any differences in this season as we begin the year, or any significant things that we should be considering?
First off, you are correct that even with the very dry conditions we saw in the northwest part of the state, there were places that really didn't do very well, but overall, people were fairly pleased with what they got up in the Northwest. And in eastern parts of the state, we did pretty well, except for a few pockets, let's say kind of in the southeast or whatever. So, and when we talk about the issues, we always talk about at least where our starting point is. And that is kind of our starting point, that most of the eastern part of the state is improved from a dryness standpoint and is really not in too bad a shape. Still some in southeastern Iowa, northwestern Iowa, despite the snow, our soils are still very dry. And because of we have frozen conditions and the snow on top of them, we're not going to get much of that moisture back in the soil. So we do have some concerns about northwest Iowa and just an overall dry soil issue. Okay, so looking ahead, the other parts of what we can see coming up this year are we're going to be very reliant on what happens in the way of spring precipitation. Fortunately, this year we're not too wet going in, so we don't foresee any kind of planting delays from that standpoint. We could possibly, pending what happens in the eastern part of the state, but we are going to be very reliant on what happens in the spring towards getting more moisture back in the soil. So that's our first concern. And then our next steps become what happens with El Nino La Nina, because we are getting out of a La Nina and possibly headed towards an El Nino by the end of the year. That could influence what our growing season is going to look like also.
You referenced a precipitation chart and a chart from the drought monitor. What's the difference in those two charts?
Sure. Well, I'll kind of throw this back. You asked about the difference in weather and climate, weather being this individual kind of thing that's summed up to a larger product. And that's the same kind of thing. What is happening in the way of precipitation, that's one product, and what that looks like from a U.S. drought monitor. Okay. Let's take a step back. The U.S. Drought Monitor is a weekly product that is an effort between USDA, National Drought Mitigation Center, several other federal agencies, and lots of state university partners. The goal of it is to try to assess what's going on in drought across the country in a weekly product that product combines a lot of input from different products. Short-term precipitation, longer-term precipitation, soil moisture, how much water have we lost to evapotranspiration, what are the impacts, time of year, all these different things come into play that affect what's going on in drought conditions around the country, because timing is always a big issue. So it's a combination of a lot of different products pieced together into a single map each week to try to assess what's going on.
And you had also referred to the La Nina and El Nino earlier. Any other comments on those, or where are we at with them?
Well, yeah, definitely to expand on those a little bit more. We have had a La Nina this winter. And again, what we're talking about here are sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean and the equator, along the equator. Those temperatures have been colder than average over the last 3 winters. So we've had 3 La Nina winters back to back. That's a fairly uncommon thing. This is only the 3rd time it's happened since 1950. So that influences our winter. Not, I say our, generally around the central U.S. Iowa is kind of in the middle of a bunch of different things, but it does influence our winter and our spring, with better chances for rain to the east of us, and then precipitation further to the north and drier in the plains area. So that's what happens during La Niñas. But that La Nina looks like it's going to fade finally and should not be influencing us beyond the winter months, December, January, February, maybe to the early part of spring. But most of spring and what looks like the summer right now are not influenced by La Nina. Okay, what does that mean for us? Well, La Ninas during the spring and summer actually increase our chances of dryness in our area, and especially in the plains area. So that is probably good news for Western Iowa and the plains area because it increases our chances for precipitation as we get into the spring. Does it mean it's going to fix all the drought issues? No, I'm not going to say that, but it increases our chances of being able to improve that situation. And then we look ahead towards what's happening with El Nino. The more likely thing looks like by fall and next winter, we're going to be getting into the opposite phase, the El Nino event. So that will influence next winter. It would increase our chances of a warmer winter. That's a fairly common thing that we've had already, but it increases our chances more. There are some of the computer models that are shifting us to El Nino by the end of summer. Now, that seems a bit unlikely and a bit quick, but if that would again increase our probability of having a good growing season. El Ninos during summers do improve your chances of having a better growing season because they tend to moderate temperatures and they increase your chances for precipitation or increase your chances of not being dry. Let's put it that way. We did some research back on my PhD, and El Nino summers, it was unlikely that you have a bad growing season. You may not have a great one, but it's unlikely to have a bad one. And then, La Nina summers tend to be the opposite side. You tended not to have good growing seasons. So it does give us a few indications. It doesn't, being in that middle, that neutral area between El Nino and La Nina, leaves wider things that are possible, but the indications are better towards improving from a drought perspective and improving our chances for a better growing season this year.
So Dennis, that may have answered my next question about precipitation, right? Thinking about just how the change in rainfall in Iowa has been affected by both of those. I think people are mentioning they're seeing notices in changes of rainfall. So what are your perspectives on, the rain falling?
Sure. And I guess this goes back to that weather versus climate question too, or seasonal versus multi-seasonal changes of what we're seeing happen. What happens with La Nina and El Nino impacts the year that we're in, and that's what we're watching this year. But there are some longer term changes in precipitation that people are taking note of, and people are starting to adjust to or adapt to. The one that when we talk with people overall and say, what do you see changing? People are saying it's getting wetter overall, and we're getting bigger rainfall events, which we are. And if you look back in Iowa over, since the beginning of the 20th century, we have gotten wetter overall. A lot of that wetness has been more springtime. There is more in other seasons, but a lot of that has been springtime wetness, which has some downsides to it in most years if your soils are not dry. This year will take a bit more of that rainfall. But embedded in this is that we're also seeing a shift in parts of western, especially northwest Iowa, where we're still seeing that spring precipitation, but we're seeing some midsummer drying, and we're drying out in the middle, in that July time period, which you say, well, if you're wet early and dry middle, that's okay. Well, that's kind of completely opposite of what most of us want from a growing season. Most people would like drier early, and then mid-season when your crop or whatever needs more water, you want more rain then. We're moving the opposite way right now. And that is a real concern, especially if you're trying to grow corn. July dryness when you're trying to grow corn can increase your stress during that critical tasseling period. So it is something we are watching very closely. We're trying to share with people. And again, people are starting to try to think about this. At one of the Crop Advantage Series meetings, I had a guy asking about this, he was taking note of it already and said he's looking at, can he plant a little bit shorter season corn and try to get in earlier so he can get it to tasseling and pass that most critical time period before that dry period comes in the middle of summer, and then looking at, what he can do the rest of the growing season after that. And I thought that was a pretty astute observation and a good thought on his part to be able to maintain productivity but avoid some of those major issues. And getting back to what the Climate Hub is, we want to try to help identify these and share these with people so that they get that opportunity to take advantage of what we have and avoid some of the worst problems that we have.
I'd like to dig just a little deeper on that idea of the changes. And we've talked about precipitation, weather and more big storms. What about temperature?
Right. Temperature is a really interesting one to talk about, because when we talk about these, we have to talk about seasonality because the changes by season. Temperature also is changing seasonally, but it's also changing quite a bit different by whether you're looking at high temperatures or low temperatures. If you look throughout about any of our seasons right now, we are getting warmer overall throughout most of the upper Midwest. But much of our warming, I guess in the wintertime, we're warming in high temperatures and low temperatures. So most of the rest of the year, especially summer, our overnight lows are what is getting warmer. There's a lot of variability in the high temperatures, but but there's not as big a trend. What we're seeing is warming, or overnight low temperatures are warming more than our high temperatures are. So you look at our temperatures overall, we're getting warmer. We're not getting as much of those high temperatures. So what that means is you don't see 100-degree days, but you see more 70-degree nights. And then your days are maybe a 90 or 95 with some higher dew points. So you still have heat episodes. They just don't feel quite the same way. And then you don't cool down at night as much. So that is a stress on crops. That's a stress on livestock that we need to be aware of. And it's also a stress on us as humans if we have to be out working in this and we can't enjoy the cool night air as much as we used to. We have to have air conditioning because it's uncomfortable. So, this is something that we really have to be aware of and does have some longer term impacts on us on a crop and livestock standpoint.
So Dennis, on the webinar that you presented here last week, you were talking about different models that maybe TV weather folks talk about. Can you explain the differences between those?
Not in great detail, but I can give you a general idea.
Okay.
And the TV forecasters will talk about the European model and the American model, and that's a little simplistic. Different meteorological organizations around the world and different countries all develop their own models, and they're all similar in that their goal is to try to take what is going on right now and use the equations of the atmosphere, and we can describe what happens in the atmosphere using equations, move those forward in time to tell us what's going to happen with the weather in just a few days, and what's going to happen in the climate as we're looking ahead, years, decades down the line. Okay, we could go off in a whole detail on that one, but from a near-term standpoint, what people are talking about from a forecast standpoint is that there's a couple different models in Europe. Most of the countries in Europe combined in their meteorological organizations to create the European Community Model, where they all contribute to this and they develop this one of their models. Great Britain has its own, the United Kingdom model. Now, from a U.S. standpoint, there's not one, there's actually several that are used in the U.S., and they all have subtle differences in how they manage the atmosphere and understand different parts of the atmosphere. So they all do things a little bit differently, and they handle different situations better, some better than others. So if you're a meteorologist and you're trying to forecast what's going on, is you look at all of them. And when they all say a very similar thing, then you get confidence as to what's going to happen. Say you look at snow tomorrow and one says 4.5 inches, one says 6 inches, one says 5.2. Then you go, okay, somewhere in this frame, we feel good. If you have one that says 3, one that says 10, and one that says nothing, then you start going, okay, which one of these is right? And what do we say about that? And that's why forecasters will sometimes say they don't have a lot of confidence because the models are all over the place, or they're shifting from one model to the next one. So it's not necessarily that one is better than the other one. And so what sometimes people are concerned about is the European model better than ours? It may be a little bit, but they handle things differently. And so that's the issue to it. Different models are built different ways to do different things. And all of them are working to improve their models more. We're not going to wake up 2 years from now and we're going to be able to forecast 10 years out in the future easily. There is this gradual progression as time goes on towards improved consistency in the models and being able to forecast more days and give you a better idea what's happening in more days. Now, from my standpoint, I don't want to get to the day where we can tell you exactly what's going to happen 7 days out, because there's a little bit of fun in all that. But certainly from certain standpoints, we definitely want to be better about what we're doing. When there's a hurricane hitting part of Florida, we need to be able to tell people within a few miles where that hurricane's going to hit, so we can make changes. We'll never probably be to the point. I had a question in one of the Crop Advantage series: how much rainfall are we going to get this year? Well, somewhere between 5 and 30 inches. So, we need to be able to do a better job with that. We're never going to be able to say, you're going to get 27.5 inches and you're going to get rain on these days. We'll never be able to do that. But we want to be able to improve to help people get better understanding about what's coming up for them.
Thanks for all the great information you shared today. As we conclude, any last reflections you want to share with our listeners?
Certainly. One of the things that we do share is certainly weather and climate is always an issue. So a couple products we want to share with people that they can use to keep themselves updated. One is the Midwest Climate Hub produces an ag outlook. We do it about once a month during the wintertime and then more frequently during the growing season, where we take a lot of these outlooks and some of the forecast information and put an ag spin or ag focus on it, so people have a better idea what's going to be coming up, so that they can hopefully make some better decisions on the ag side. You can go to our website and sign up, and get to the sign up for our new, it says newsletter, but you can also when we create a new ag outlook, you'll get an email about that. The other one is we help co-sponsor a monthly webinar series that is the third Thursday of each month. This is a North Central region webinar series. I work with a colleague from NOAA and a bunch of other folks regionally at state, federal, universities to share information, what's going on, and then talk about the outlooks for the whole North Central U.S. You can reach out to me. I can show you where to sign up for that. It's free. It's really a useful webinar. It continues to grow in activity and interest, because it does provide a fairly concise context for what's going on and what people can see coming up. Or people can always reach out to me. I'm always happy to share information with what's going on and what we're seeing.
I do want to note that the webinar you presented last week will also be posted on our Extension Dairy Team website, and we'll include the link with this podcast for those listeners who want to see it and gain a more in-depth interpretation of the information. Thanks again, Dennis, for being on the podcast. Jen, I always appreciate working with you. Thanks for joining us today, and look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from Iowa State University.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.